What's up, guys? We out here. You're listening to Maylee, your donut princess, and you're listening to Short and Sweet, a donut princess podcast. And I bring on some amazing guests. I talk about things that I wish were talked about more often, and I highlight especially what people are up to, especially if they look like me or share similar culture as I do. I just feel that we are really, there needs to be more representation and more inspiration for the next generation. So that's why I do what I do. Today, I'd love to welcome Christina Vo to the building. Thank you, Christina, for joining us today.
Thank you. Happy to
Christina
be here.
Christina is a new author. She just wrote a book called The Veil Between Two Worlds, a memoir of silence, loss, and finding home. We were introduced by my friend Amy, who owns Quill House Publishing. So I can't wait to dive in. Tell us a little bit about your story before you became an author. And did you ever think that you would be an author?
So actually I've been writing for a long time, at least like a decade, and I worked as a professional writer for about 4 years, but it took me a long time, like until my early 40s to get to this point. I think because I've been writing a lot about, family history. My mom passed away when I was a teenager, and that actually took quite a long time to process. And I was distant from my father for a little bit, and also my sister. Yeah, I think I've always wanted to be a writer, but I think actually coming out and claiming that took me a while. And, I did various other things in my career, all around sort of communications. And I also had a floral design business, but writing's always been sort of at the heart of what I really wanted to do. But it just took me some time, which I'm actually okay with. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And yeah, I think that's a one really interesting thing to think about is when we're younger, or even if we're professional writers, we just never really claim that we have that writer title. I don't know who needs to hear this, but if you can put a pen and paper down, if you can type something up and create it with your thoughts and your ideas and have a storyline, like you're a writer, and it takes some time to reclaim that. Do you think that there's any influence from your family as to why you didn't further, claim this writer title beforehand? Or was it just kind of like, "Oh, okay, now I've decided that I'm a writer"?
Well, I think, maybe a lot of Asian Americans could relate to this, but my parents were both doctors. My mom didn't practice when she came to the States, but they met in medical school in Vietnam. And my dad always wanted me to follow that path of, being a doctor. So in college, I was pre-med. I hated it, and it caused me a lot of turmoil. So I changed to public health because I thought, oh, that will still make him happy because it's still in the realm of healthcare, but it was not what I actually wanted to do. Um, but ironically, my dad actually started writing also after my mom passed away. So
Mm,
he wrote his first memoir, 1994, after, or probably a few years after, 96 or something. But he actually continued to write about Vietnamese history because
mm,
he really, I later understood through his writing, I think his greatest love was Vietnam, South Vietnam, and losing, having to leave, I think was, the biggest experience of his life, even beyond like the loss of his first son and my mom and, all the other things that happened in his life. So he
yeah.
actually has written, I don't know, many books and put together anthologies with different Vietnamese American writers and refugees, and has had a real passion for that. So over the years, especially the last, I would say 10 to 15 years. No, he has actually really been an inspiration. And, not so much
Great.
early on in my life, but later when I saw his commitment to that, I think it really encouraged me to continue and to realize that it really just requires sort of sitting down, and
Yeah.
and it takes a long time, but, and maybe it won't for some people, but it's worth it.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
No, thank you for sharing that. And I'm so glad that your father was able to find a little bit of healing through writing, and that he's proud and has inspired you. I think that's kind of a very different way than I experienced, where my mom and dad heavily discouraged me from writing because they wanted me to go into business, and they weren't really sure, how the world was going to change and appreciate writers. But I think, with your dad being there and being like, you should write, it's very encouraging. Have you guys ever thought about like doing a book together at all?
So actually, the first book that will be published in the spring is actually like a lot more recent work. But because I started writing so long ago, I actually wrote a lot when I went back to Vietnam in my 20s. It wasn't until
Mhm.
my late 20s I started actually documenting these stories. But I actually did put together something that I'm working on now that goes back and forth with our story. So
Oh,
it's
yeah.
both. Yeah, and I love it. It's a very, very rough draft, and I need a little break from it, but I'll pick it up again and edit it and go through that process. But it's really special because it kind of interweaves our stories about Vietnam. And to me, it's the most meaningful. It's literally the most meaningful project I've ever done in my life. And it needs some editing, it needs some work, but I think it's beautiful because it shows two different perspectives, from different generations about Vietnam. And for me, my sort of adult identity, and Vietnamese identity really formed by going back to Vietnam, not being here
Yeah.
because my parents didn't speak to me in Vietnamese. We didn't grow up. I didn't grow up with a lot of Vietnamese people around me or having much family around me. So, and even in college, I actually didn't start having, a lot of Asian friends until the last few years of college. And then when I went to Vietnam after college, that's when my whole world, kind of opened up to Vietnamese heritage and my Vietnamese identity.
I love that. And like I think a lot of people don't understand the connection or that feeling once you're back in where the country that your parents were from. Because I experienced a little bit from when my mom and I would go back to Cambodia. And
Yes.
like there's just something about where they're from. Either it's like the culture, the food, the people, and that gives yourself this calling or this question of like, "Oh, well, I want to know more. I want to know more about my culture. I want to know more about my family." And finding that connection there rather than living here in the US, where I had a similar experience to you of like never really growing up with a lot of Asian people. I was the only Asian girl in my high school. And then going to college, I went to UCSD where there were a lot of Asians, but
Yes.
just, like that discovery doesn't really happen until you're later on in life, or there's something that really calls you to really like go into that. You brought up two amazing points that I want to get into. And the first point was when you were talking about like, your like I want to talk about the process of like how you processed when your parents came over here as boat people. So for people who don't know what boat people are, could you kind of like explain a little bit of what that's like and why did they decide to come here?
So my parents actually came separately. And so and my dad first, he was actually working as a doctor for the South Vietnamese army. And he
Mm,
actually got lucky because right before the end of the war, right before the fall of Saigon, he was transferred to an island called Phu Quoc. And so when Saigon fell, there were, already boats waiting for people, for Vietnamese refugees to leave. So he
mm,
actually was able to leave and left my mom, behind
mhm,
in Saigon, and she didn't come until the year after. And she actually technically
mhm,
wasn't a person. I mean, she flew to France, and then from France, reconnected with my dad and arrived in the States. But yeah, I mean, it's a big, and they didn't talk about it. I don't know about your how your parents were with their history, but my parents actually did not speak about everything. I learned about their history has not it did not come from them sharing stories with me, which was why it was so important. Another reason why really wanted to write, because after my mom passed away and when I went back to Vietnam and then when my dad started writing, I actually started to put together the pieces of their story that they never verbally expressed to me. And
mm,
still, I mean,
mhm.
my father has never really sat down with me. He doesn't really communicate that much. Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, I
but through
understand that.
through his writing, I read about his journey over here, and then building his life, and going, having to be recertified as a doctor, and then I just feel it's so important for and I don't think I talk to a lot of friends about this. I don't think that everybody needs to necessarily publish what they're doing, and to me that shouldn't be people's goals in writing. But first, as healing and understanding for yourself, and
Mhm.
holding your family stories, and if you have children, to be able to pass those on, and then if
Yes.
publishing happens because you want it to and you think it's important, then it can happen. But I kind of wish people would just do it just for themselves and for their families first and foremost. You know what I
Mhm,
mean?
mhm. I think the reason why there's a lack of that is there's not really like a calling of like importance of like you should have something documented for your family. I think
Yes.
for me, my inspiration was there was no artifacts for the family that we could pass on to like when like later on when I want to have kids, right?
Yes.
Like what if they ask me, "Hey, like what did grandma do? Like how did grandma get here?" I want to give them the full details of like what happened because there's so many lessons that like
I-
occur in their lifetimes in the way they got here, and it's just this like this piece of history I don't want to forget. And on
yes.
top of that, it's like the family stories, it's we are grown up with just a very strong sense of family, no matter, like family is number one in a lot of Asian cultures.
Yes.
And if you are confused about your family history, then how will you connect with it? You really want to go. I really wanted to create something for my family so that they could like always go back to it and refer to it as to like what really went down versus relying on a history book to retell that story and narrative.
Yes. Or yeah. And I think that there are, as my with my peers, with my friends, a lot of them who I met in Vietnam, when I first went there,
Mhm.
it's becoming, we're talking more about that as our parents get older and are in their like mid seven. I just think, yet it's true. And it's like, if you don't, I think it's also important to heal
Mhm.
the wounds that maybe our parents' generation didn't heal. And
Yeah.
each generation, in my opinion, has a certain role, and
Mhm.
that's sort of evolutionary, right? And
Yeah.
yeah, and a lot of times, I don't know. I mean, they went through a lot, our parents'
A
generation.
lot. Seriously, a lot.
A
Like
lot.
I always talk to my friends about how we were born at like the perfect time. Like we knew what it was like with or without internet, where there's
Yes.
no like immediate war in our country right now. And not like to say what's happening in Ukraine is not happening, but it's like we're not in the thick of it. You know what I
Yes.
mean? Earlier you mentioned that your father, he doesn't communicate that much. And actually my father doesn't communicate that much either. Do you think that this is a result of a little bit of the trauma of not being able to speak out and staying quiet? Because my mom, when she was in the Khmer Rouge and she was younger, one of the brainwashing principles that they tried to do to the kids was if you ever speak about what happened here, they will find you in the world and kill you. And just really like strong threats of like this power that had taken over. I want to know if the experience was similar for you or
I
for your
think
father.
I think so. I mean, I think, because I mean, I even think back of like when I was like a younger woman, right? And even
Mhm.
even now, sometimes as a woman, I feel like we're also just given opportunities, permission to ourselves and to other women to speak up. Like even
Mhm.
for us, not even talking about our Asian identity, but just as women, how long
Yeah.
it's taken us to have a voice, right? And I think for Asian men, there's just, well, I'm generalizing here, but I think men in do have a more difficult time expressing their emotions. I mean,
Yeah.
women, we are more expressive. We do rely more on connections. I think men tend to rely on their partners, but I think women tend to like connect more broadly. And I do think, yes, the history of in most Asian cultures, just like Confucianism coming down, and just
Mhm.
like the hierarchy in the family. But then I think for my dad, he's always been a quiet man, but and then I can imagine him like learning all these new, like learning the medical technology, being in a medical system that he didn't understand, not knowing how other things work, right? I
Mhm.
try to think of myself in that situation, and how, and not all refugees and immigrants like have that challenge. I think
Mhm.
my father is a particularly like more kind of soft spoken person, but I
Mhm.
just reflect back on sort of all of his times, and just I can't imagine. I mean, I think it must have been so, and then to lose my mom and then be
Yeah.
left with like two teenage daughters. And I
Right.
remember there was this one time, we were living in Indiana in this small town, like 13,000 people. And my dad accidentally called the wrong number. And I was just a teenager. My dad accidentally called the wrong number. And this guy kept calling him back and yelling at him because my
Mm.
dad didn't know what to do. And he just hung up. And the
Hmm.
guy was like furious because my dad just hung up the phone. But and I don't know. I just think I just feel so. I just have a lot of compassion for my dad, thinking
Yeah.
of this like Asian man in a room full of being the minority and but yet having so much. And I think that's why he wrote a lot, actually, because I
Yeah.
think he had so much that he wanted to share and say that he wasn't able to. I feel that way sometimes. I don't know about
Yeah.
you. I
Yeah.
feel like sometimes I can express myself better through writing than
Yeah.
yeah, even to closest friends, so
Yeah. It takes a
yeah.
minute to really like sit down and like kind of formulate your thoughts in the way that you want to. And when you do give yourself that time, then it kind of comes out and you're like, you give yourself the permission to express. But
Yes.
going back to your dad, yeah, like I think what writing does is it really like explains this point of view, this idea, what happened, and it's not only therapeutic for the author who's maybe he has nowhere else to turn to talk to. Maybe he's living in Indiana or he's the only, browner person there.
Yes.
But at least when you're in writing, you get to understand yourself. And in the stories that we get to share about our parents, that's where compassion comes in, not only from like a daughter father relationship,
Yeah.
but from like as a whole of society, of looking at any Asian man and knowing that they've been through a lot to get to where they are now. And I
Yes.
think that is really missing from our society today, is that compassion. Like we look at more of like stereotypes to guide us through like what we think about people, but we don't really look at each individual case scenario about compassion.
And their story, right? And their
Mhm.
personal, and oftentimes that's because we don't actually have the time to reflect on every individual. But at least for those who are in our intimate circle, if we can at least think more compassionately about their perspective and like what they've gone through. And I mean,
Yeah.
even with this project with my dad, because a lot of the writing I had to like retype because it was from
Mhm.
his original memoir that I incorporated into my writing. And even doing that helped me understand him so much more, like typing his words, and
Mhm.
typing about when he was a retyping when he was a kid. And he had there were five boys in his family, but he was sent to, when he was like 9 or 10, to his grandmother's, while the rest of the family stayed back in Saigon. And even that, like
Mm.
childhood memory of like, why was I the one that was sent away when the rest of my family, so I
Yeah.
just like, so I just felt for him so, deeply by through this process, like seeing him much more as a person than as my father, who I
Yeah.
might have been so critical of in previous years.
Yeah, and I love that you bring that up, because I feel like once you like hit your like 30s, or even maybe slightly before that, you
Yeah.
start to look at your parents more like as a friend versus like a parent figure. And then all of a sudden the guilt and the shame of like your child relationship kind of melts away, and you again you have that compassion and kindness for them, and seriously exactly what they went through. And it's just so powerful when you can like take what their words are and their stories, their perspective, and turn it into writing and art.
Yes. And
We're gonna
that's
take
true healing.
Mhm.
That, I mean,
It
I
is.
think like, yeah, transforming our trauma and or pain or any, it doesn't even have to be traumatic, but just like any of our life experience into something that we want to share
Mhm.
is art.
It seriously is, and I don't think people know like that writing is an art. Writing is a true art. I mean, it's poet, like even anything from poetry, fiction, or even memoir style. All sorts of writing. It's an expression through our words, and sometimes these words are all we have left to recount what happened. So, for our audience who has no idea what the veil between two worlds is, could you give us like a brief synopsis of it?
It's so hard to get to a brace. I'm still working on that. Yeah, so it's being published next April, and
Okay.
basically, sort of the short version is it's kind of, it's definitely a spiritual memoir that covers a 2-year period of my life from like when I'm turning 40 until recently.
Mhm.
So between 40 and 42, with a lot of backstory into into my family history.
Mhm.
Um, and there's a close friend who's a big part of that. But it's really, yeah, I mean, it's really about a spiritual transformation and
Mhm.
and healing and coming from San Francisco to Santa Fe. So there's also like sort of a little travel part of it, and
Mhm.
plant medicine ceremonies, and meeting different guides, and then ultimately I would say finding my own sort of spiritual authority. Because I think there's a lot of noise out there,
Mhm.
and I think especially like there's this coaching industry, and there's this growing spiritual,
Mhm.
all sorts of resources. There are people going to plant medicine, and I think all of them are, any path one chooses. I mean, I think that's up to the individual, whether
Mhm.
they're religious or spiritual but not religious. I'm supportive of those paths, but I do think that sometimes people can get kind of lost in that, on that
Yeah.
journey, with
Yeah.
with giving too much authority to others, because really
Mhm.
it's our own journey, and we
Yeah.
really do know. I mean, it's a lot of work to get to the heart of our wounds, and finding that healing.
Yeah.
But I do believe that we can find the answers within.
Absolutely. When you say spiritual too, so this is a memoir, meaning that it's based all everything is true, or is
Yes.
there some parts that are not true? Okay, so when you're talking about the plant medicine thing, was that something that you went through?
Yeah, so I went to a few. There are a few plant medicine ceremonies that I sort of, and they were
Okay.
very, you know, they were very significant. Like my first one was just really a beautiful experience, where
Mhm.
it was an ayahuasca ceremony, but
Mhm.
where I just at the very end sort of felt this like very powerful sort of creative force that
Yeah.
was, kind of explaining like, this is why we're here to create,
Yeah.
right? And this is
Right.
like, and the room kind of, changed, and
Mhm.
it was definitely a different experience.
Oh,
But
yeah.
it really landed with me, because I realized what I do feel we're here as we're all creators. We are all
Mhm.
meant to create. It doesn't mean everybody has to write a book, or
Right.
everybody has a same form of creation. For some people, I think, raising children is a very creative form of way of being in the world. Like, I'm
Yeah.
supportive of any way that, I mean, we're all just meant to express our unique selves, however one feels called to do that. I mean, that's
Definitely.
what I found in my, like, the most meaningful. My connection to my writing is really the way that I feel most connected to the universe, and to people, and to life itself, really.
Yeah. And tell us a little bit about like the writing process because I know you mentioned earlier that when you do write, there are some times when you need to like put it down and walk away for a second. I know I had to really do that with my parents or my mom's journey. There were a lot of heavy parts that once I like really went in and refined, I was like, whoa, like this is really sad. Like this is really powerful. This is like really angry. So, like walk us through, what the writing process for you was like.
I think some of it, like I said, so in my, or like late 20s, early 30s, I wrote a lot, like every day. And I completed a manuscript which is partly incorporated into this book with my father, and then
Mhm.
some parts are in this current memoir. So there have been bits and pieces that I've been working on for a long time. Like you said, like sometimes you have to put it away, and
Mhm.
for me, putting it away was years in some cases. And then a lot of the more recent story, obviously that was current, because I was kind of doing it along the way. But I
Mhm.
mean, I try to write like 5 or 6 times a week, and
Okay.
I do it first thing in the morning, and I have
Nice.
multiple things kind of going on. I mean, I have
Yeah.
like a main project that I'm working on, but like I told you, the draft of the book with my dad, that's just sitting. And I think it's kind of like you have to kind of go with intuition. I try to give myself a rough time frame, like, okay, I'm going to take this amount of time away from that project, and then I'll go back to it like in January. And so
Mhm.
like this current project that I'm working on, I want to finish a draft by the end of the year. And
Mhm.
that I'll just put away for a few months, and then come back to it. And then I don't know, I don't really know how I created a process. It's just kind of like a project by project basis. But with the first memoir, I actually joined a memoir writing class
Mm.
that really helped me. So it was a 6-month class. And every other week we were required to submit, not required, I mean, if you miss, you miss, but
Yeah.
you miss the opportunity to get feedback. So every 2 weeks I submitted a chapter, and that really helped me kind of get in the structure of completing,
Hmm.
that class really, I mean, gave me the structure, I think, to actually finally finish a book. I think if I wouldn't have taken that, I probably would have still been doing the same thing, like just working on
Mm,
things and not pushing myself to
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, that's good that
And
you
I mean,
had that class
yeah.
because now you learn the structure of like, okay, you need to have deadlines. You can't just like let it like float in
Yes.
the universe.
And you also have to, I think I'm okay with letting so much time pass before really trying to publish anything. But I think if I would have had more guidance, so I mean, I do believe in like I've hired people as like writing teachers, coaches, working one-on-one,
Mhm.
before I've joined group classes. I think those are all super helpful for people who want to, and also hiring, if you have the resources, hiring developmental editors. I
Oh
think
yeah.
I recently, I read somebody's book recently, and I thought it was like good writing, but I thought also she had hired a developmental editor. It would have been much, because there are people who are professionals at,
Yeah.
knowing how to weave stories together. And I
Mhm.
think we all get better with that with time if you continue writing, but there's also nothing wrong with hiring support.
Absolutely.
You know?
Especially an expert. You don't have to
Yes.
figure out all of it on your own. Like as like an artist, a writer, you already are funneling the ideas. So you kind of need a little bit of help along the way to make it, perfect.
Yes.
So, with your book coming out in April, you've got quite a few more things to do, right? To prep for the launch.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the D-Day where you're like, okay, like this is the date. And I'm glad you're giving yourself deadlines because a lot of us can procrastinate. Like this can be
Yeah.
something that can be like, I'm gonna write a book and then it takes you like 20 years, or you could like actually be serious and like, give yourself actual deadlines. I know because when I was, I wanted to write this book when I was 8 years old, but
Oh,
either I was a procrastinator, my mom and dad discouraged me from doing it, but it was only until I had like there was a transition in my life where I was able to have some more time and sit down and actually get it done. And the process for me was just like, gathering my mom's stories, like writing them, then going back and like making it, worthy of a story and like gathering all the details, having an editor look at it, illustrator, bam. And I self-published, but you're working with Amy for
oh
publishing.
no,
What's
no,
that?
no. I'm
Oh,
not working. Oh no, I'm
oh,
working
okay.
with so the woman that I just met Amy through, but I really appreciate Amy. Yeah, I met Amy through other contacts, and I just
Okay.
really,
Okay,
yeah,
got
she
it.
I think
Got it.
she's so great, and I love what she's doing.
Yeah.
I'm working with a hybrid publisher, which is kind of a mix between, tradition.
Mm,
It's like basically an indie publisher, but it was my teacher. So in the memoir writing class, she owns a publishing company, and I just trusted her so
mhm.
much that I wanted this first book to be published with them because it's also only for female authors, and
Cool.
I loved the community as well.
Yeah.
With the books that I'm working on now, I am going to try to, because basically I just felt urgency, and I was
Mhm,
right about that. I knew that I needed to get this book out so that I
mhm,
had a book coming out, because earlier I said publishing doesn't matter, but it's like, I mean, I am committed to having a writing career. If people
mhm.
aren't committed to having a writing career, then publishing won't matter. But if you do
Right.
want to have, a career as a writer, so I didn't want to go through the process of like waiting additional years. I
Yeah.
felt very ready, so I'm very happy with what I decided for this. And I don't know. I don't know how you feel, but I feel like once you get the book out, it's just like you make all these additional connections that, I mean,
Mhm.
it's that, even for me with Amy, I mean, we were messing, there are just so many ways that I think writers who are especially sharing, like working on memoir or sharing personal stories, connect to one another and support one another. That's really
Yeah.
beautiful. And recognize that there's space for everyone's stories, different
Mhm,
audiences,
mhm.
different.
Yeah, I feel like there's like a spiritual shift that happens where like you write a book and then all of a sudden like there's all these people that appear in your life and you're like, "Whoa, like I and where were you before this?" Or like, "Oh, like it's so cool I get to meet you after this because if you didn't write the book, you wouldn't have pulled that energy." And I experience that a lot when I do book events, and there's like my like inspiration is like the little girls who come up to me or the younger girls and they're like, "I loved your book." Like like and they'll share stuff about it and stuff like that is so heartwarming. It gives me this purpose to know like, okay, like what I did, it's actually making an impact. People are actually reading it and like loving it and appreciating it, which is amazing. And I just also wanted to talk to you about, like your personal trauma and of like our family's history. Like, do you think you'll ever fully overcome that? Were you doing a lot of unpacking of that trauma while you were writing? Because I know I did.
Yeah, and I think I don't know if we ever fully recover. You know what I mean? I
Yeah,
think because when you think about it, I mean, even I have, one of my best friends I've known for 20 years. He's actually, a large part of this memoir, forthcoming memoir. But even him and I like had some things happen recently that I realize it's related to, because we project things that have happened in and some things we don't even know are ours, right? I don't know if
exactly.
yeah, like some of this, I mean, because I have trauma around like abandonment and at one point I realized like this isn't just mine. This is also my mom's. This is
Hmm.
my mom's from when my dad left her in Saigon and then her, my brother, her first child passed away. Like she had that trauma
Yeah.
that if that's not fully healed within a person, it passes on to the next generation. So I did inherit a lot of my mom's trauma. I do think
Mhm.
I've worked through a lot of it, but things come up, and I think that that's just life, right? Like I think we'll always be I think that's where like awareness comes in, that we need to like take
Mhm.
time to really
Mhm.
look at the dynamics between us and different people who are in our lives and like try to see like, is it really this person, this experience with this person that's triggering me, or is it something deeper? And
Yeah.
I think when we overreact, we know that it's something that's not really, because there have been times when little things like trigger me and I'm like, this isn't about that person, because that person I've only known a few months, or
Mhm.
that person isn't a big part of my life, but there was
Yeah.
a trigger there that I need to explore,
Yes,
you know?
I definitely can resonate with this the what life gives us as triggers, it's most like there's something within that you haven't really looked at yet. And again, like you said, you're projecting it out. And like, that's where we also like gossip, blame, like all these like
Yes.
ways that we learned how to process, but it's not actually the real way that you'll get over what you're dealing with. And human beings, I mean, we deal with so much, even like in our generation where it's like things are a little bit easier than our parents, we still go through things. We still go through assimilating and figuring out our purpose. And there's still those basic like human questions we ask ourselves. And we just have to really realize like there's a lot of self work that comes through with writing as well, of learning how to heal ourselves from these things that we've learned from our parents.
Yes. And just, I mean, I think, and a part of it is just like the, being human, right? Like just being
Mhm.
like, I mean, I know, and it seems that you do too. It's like, just wanting to be a better person, right?
Yeah.
Wanting to be
Yeah.
a person that doesn't inflict any harm unintentionally onto others through our interactions, right? Being a conscious individual that walks through life with awareness doesn't mean we won't make mistakes, and doesn't mean we won't like unfairly project something, but just to at least attempt to, be a better person. Because I think
Yeah.
we need that in the world, right? We need,
Yeah. I think that awareness goes hand in hand with like responsibility. Like I
yeah,
think learning to take responsibility with integrity was one of the biggest lessons that I learned of being an adult and processing my own trauma and my parents' trauma, is because when you take responsibility, even for things that might not be, something you're responsible for, but maybe it's a reaction to
yes,
something, it's I think for like people who haven't done personal development, it would be being the bigger person, like, and I feel that if any of us can take a lesson from that of like learning to take responsibility, I think you're right. I think the world would be better because we're constantly bettering ourselves and knowing like blaming people isn't going to get anywhere.
no.
like, I guess a little bit of why I condense it into like these little golden nuggets is because sometimes when you're going through life and somebody says that one thing to you, you hold it, and because it's a tip, it's a guiding like piece of information from the universe that goes, "Oh, that's exactly what I need to hear right now." So, today we're going to be talking about the finding peace, clarity, and purpose in your life as a writer. So, if you could share 5 tips on that of your own experience for maybe somebody out there who wants to write their own book, is going through going through their family stories, or just want to unpack some trauma.
I mean, I think like one thing, and these are it's kind of two things. I think meditation and spending time alone. So those would be two things. Because
Mhm,
I think quieting the mind is so important to get
mhm,
to anything, whether you want to be a
yeah,
writer or not. You know,
mhm,
for example, for me moving from San Francisco to Santa Fe, which is so much more peaceful and it's so much more expansive, it
mhm,
helped me to see where I was often operating out of this, the survival mode, the fight or
mm,
flight. And that's when you're in that mode, you can't be in the creative space.
right.
So that's why I think, having time where you're quiet, where you're connected to yourself,
Mhm,
whether that's meditation or whatever practice helps you find that sort of centering within,
mhm,
that will, I think, is like the first step, to kind of get yourself out of that reactive mode and
mhm,
really into more of a creative space. And then I think, like following your intuition, because
mhm,
like you said, you knew, when you were 8 years old, you wanted to write the story. The same when my mom was sick, when I was 14,
mm,
and I was sitting with her some mornings, because she would still wake up before my sister and I woke up. And I heard a voice then that was like, oh, you should write this story. You should start
mm,
writing now. And I didn't, I didn't
mhm,
listen to my intuition, and that it kept coming up. And I think what your calling will keep knocking at the door until you listen to it, right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
you will continue to be dissatisfied. You'll find glimmers of happiness and satisfaction, but I for me at least, until I finally committed to my deeper purpose, that's when I found real peace in my life. Because
mhm,
there's no question about why for me, like I'm not questioning like, why am I here? I Even if I just have a few hours to write in a morning, I feel satisfied with the day, if
mhm,
that makes sense. So I think,
yeah,
people listening to their intuition, listening to that calling, listening to whatever. And even if you have to, if you have to work and pay your bills one way and have your creative passion on the side, carve out time for that. Even if
mhm,
wake up earlier, like commit, that's another tip, is just persistence and commitment. When you
mhm,
hear something calling you, listen to it. And if it's taking classes, I don't know, if you want to be a painter or you want to get into some visual art, just do something about it. Make one step toward that, a class,
mhm,
and then
mhm,
continue to carve out time for that, because it will fully, enrich your life. And then I think the last thing is just, about like sort of, which we didn't really talk much about, but I think is very important, just envisioning what you
mhm,
want in your life,
mhm,
what you want, how you want to feel in your days. I mean, I so believe that this has the power to transform that we can actually create, almost every moment of our lives just by
yeah,
training our brain and having that peace, and then having a vision for how we want things to unfold. I mean, I know if I feel nervous about something during the day, then I try to reframe and say, this is going to be a great experience, or this is going to be easy for me. And if I tell myself that, it often is.
mhm.
um, so
Those
yeah, so those
those
are.
those are some great tips. And so going off of the last one about envisioning, where when you like think about your perfect reader who will read your book, like could you describe to me like where they are, how they're feeling, and like would like yeah, could you describe
Yeah,
that to
I
me?
mean, I think my ideal reader is probably someone just like a few, probably a little bit younger than me, because I think that that person might be starting on their spirit, just starting, or kind of mid, on their spiritual path, but
Mhm,
looking for their spiritual authority, might be trying out different like groups and communities, and also finding their voice. I do think my ideal reader is a woman, and
mhm,
somebody who's trying to pull all the pieces together of their story,
mhm,
and find that both like inner purpose, but also spiritual peace and authority.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
thank you for sharing all of that. Where can people find you and purchase your book when it's published?
So I think the best way is my just my website, christinavo.com, because then all the information will be on there. But it is on Amazon now, to pre-order, even though it's not being published until April.
Very
So
nice.
yeah,
Yeah.
but all that information is on my website.
Awesome. Yeah, no, and so you guys, if you guys are listening, definitely pre-order her book. Will you be doing any like events or anything in like the LA area or you in the Santa Fe area to promote your book?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just kind of working on things now. I mean, I'd love to do something in LA. I am going to do a few things in Santa Fe. I'm just
Hmm.
trying to figure out how, and then also in San Francisco. But I think it will be around writing and healing because that's kind of
Yeah.
the angle that is starting to resonate with people and something that I feel good about too. Just so I don't have anything like formalized yet, but those are the things that we're sort of talking about when I'm talking with some venues here. So I'm super
Amazing.
excited. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, stay tuned with Christina. Make sure you check out her book on Amazon to pre-order. And if you're in the Santa Fe area, definitely keep, follow her so you can highlight, support, and celebrate this amazing piece of art that you're going to put out in this world that will not only has contributed to your own healing, but also to the healing of others as well. So thank you so much for being on the podcast today, Christina.
Thank you so much for having me.
For those of you listening, definitely check it out, and I will talk to you next time. Holla at your girl.